A Ghanaian diplomat is proposing, agitating, and trying to sell to other Africans the need for Africans to have one single currency to make the continent stronger and more viable economically and otherwise. Recall that on several occasions, many prominent Africans have questioned the rationale behind the fact that when fellow Africans want to enter or travel to other African countries, we still need to get visas to enter other African countries. They have questioned why can't Africa implement visa-free entry to fellow African nations. However, in this time, it is a Ghanaian diplomat agitating and requesting that Africa initiate a unified currency, a single currency that will be used within the continent to make it more viable.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have the distinguished privilege and honor of presenting to us His Excellency, Dr. Mohammed Ibn Chambas, a quintessential leader, icon of democracy in Africa, international diplomat, continental peacemaker, as the guest speaker for the 13th annual ZIS lecture. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that very warm introduction. It's much appreciated. Chairman for the occasion, the Executive Governor of Enugu State, His Excellency Dr. Peter Mba, the Chief Host for the occasion, the Executive Governor, Anambra State, His Excellency Professor Charles Soludo, ably represented here by my brother, the Deputy Executive Governor. The Vice Chancellor, the benefactor of the Zik Memorial Lecture Series, most distinguished Senator, Dr. Ben Ndiobi, CON, Ojelibo Indigo, and Madame Chaka Obi. His Royal Majesty, the Obi of Onitsha, Nyameka Achebe, other royal fathers here present, the mother of the day, Her Excellency, Professor Uche Azikiwe, all protocols duly observed, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to thank the Nnamdi Azikiwe University for inviting me to give this year's edition of the Zik Lectures. I'd also like to extend my deep appreciation to the benefactor of the Nnamdi Azikiwe Lecture Series, Senator, High Chief, Dr. Ben Obi, CON, Jelibo Ndibo, and to Mrs. Chaka Obi for the very warm, traditional Anambra hospitality that has been extended to my delegation and I since our arrival in Nigeria. My lecture comes in a long line of impressive, thought-provoking ones previously given by a lot of notable African personalities, including my own former boss, late President of Ghana, Jerry John Rawlings, and several other personalities already mentioned today. We are gathered to commemorate the life of one of the leading lights of Pan-Africanism, the great Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. Some knew him as the father of Nigerian nationalism. Others called him by his traditional title, the Owele of Onitsha. But he has been popularly revered simply as Zik of Africa, and for good reason. He lived a full life, most of which was sacrificed for the freedom of his beloved country, Nigeria, and of Africa. I never had the honor of meeting Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. Even though I did not have this privilege of knowing him personally, his death touched me deeply. It was a Saturday like this one, May 11, 1996. On that fateful day, the world lost a giant. A great African baobab tree had fallen. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria and one of the most influential figures of Africa's independence movement, passed away at the University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital in Enugu after a prolonged illness. At the time of his death, Zik of Africa was 91, a man whose life stretched across nearly an entire century, a century in which the course of African history itself was radically changed. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, born on November 16, 1904, in Zunguri, northern Nigeria, and as our chairman has reminded us, the Venerable Zik would have been 120 years today. He came into the world at a time when the colonial machinery was tightening its grip across Africa. His upbringing was shaped by his colonial context, one that he spent a lifetime dismantling through the power of ideas, activism, and leadership. Zik, as he was fondly called, was more than a politician. He was a visionary with a relentless belief in the promise of an emergent Africa, where national borders mattered less than the shared goals of freedom and progress of all Africans. The news of his passing spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves across Nigeria and beyond. The tributes that poured in were not just from Nigerian statesmen or African leaders. He was mourned globally as a symbol of the fight for freedom and dignity of our continent. Leaders from all over the world prepared to pay their final respects, understanding that Zik's legacy went beyond borders and politics. For many, he wasn't just a statesman. He embodied the ideal of a free Africa, taking its rightful place in the world, united and transcending tribal allegiances and separate nation states. When the announcement of Zik's death reached Accra, the urgency to honor his life was immediate. I was summoned as then Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to participate in the consultations about Ghana's official delegation to his funeral. It was decided that the Honorable Kojo Botio, a former foreign minister in Nkrumah's first government and one of Osagyefo's closest allies during the Ghana struggle for independence, would lead the delegation, and rightly so. Botio was no stranger to Zik. In 1947, when Zik and his colleagues from Nigeria, which included Mrs. Fumilayo Razon-Kuti, the mother of the Afrobeat king Fela, were preparing for the Pan-African Congress in London, it was Botio who had traveled from Oxford, where he was then a student, to London to assist them in the secretarial work for that important occasion. Zik did not forget to mention this when he met Botio again in 1959, this time as part of Nkrumah's entourage to Enugu, this led by Osagyefo himself when he came as Prime Minister of Ghana to the Eastern House of Assembly. That was another giant, talking of the Osagyefo. And there's no way you can tell the story of one of them without telling the story of the other. After all, Zik it was who influenced Nkrumah to go to America and inspired him to attend his alma mater, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, from where Zik himself had graduated with a master's degree in 1932. I was assigned the responsibility of delivering this decision to Honorable Kojo Botio personally. I can still recall the gravity of that moment, informing him that he would lead Ghana's delegation to the funeral of his old friend, Zik, a man with whom Ghana shared so much history. That moment reminded me of how deeply interconnected our histories are, how the legacy of men like Azikiwe, Nkrumah, and others shape not only the destiny of our own nations, but the entire African continent. And these great men have left upon us the responsibility to push forward the vision of a strong, prosperous, and dignified Africa that they had only begun to construct. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Zik was not called Zik of Africa for nothing. He preached and practiced Pan-Africanism right from his student days overseas to when he returned to the continent. After his studies abroad, where he earned multiple degrees in political science, anthropology, and religion, Zik could have returned directly to Nigeria to join the growing nationalist movement. But instead, he chose Ghana, then the Gold Coast, as a site to begin his practical engagement with African nationalism. In 1934, he became the editor of the African Morning Post in Accra, where his journalism was radical and unflinching. Through his column, The Inside Stuff, he advocated for Black pride, criticized colonialism, and promoted the idea of a united Africa. Zik's time in Ghana was a significant chapter in his life, as it illustrated his belief in the interconnectedness of African struggles. He understood that liberation in one part of Africa was meaningless if others remained shackled under colonialism. His philosophy of unity wasn't just theoretical, it was lived and practiced. This is the same spirit that drove him to establish the West African Pilot, which acquired controlling interest in 12 other Afrocentric newspapers in Nigeria when he finally came home. And this became powerful tools for the nationalist movement. His journalism was not a profession for him, but a weapon used to expose injustice, dismantle colonial narratives, and awaken African consciousness. When Zik returned to Nigeria, his political journey began in earnest. He co-founded the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons with Herbert Macaulay, Nigeria's leading nationalist at the time. As one of the most influential figures in the struggle for Nigerian independence, Zik tirelessly advocated for self-government. His political career was not without its setbacks. He faced opposition, betrayal, and even physical threats. Yet, Zik remained committed to his cause, believing that Nigeria's freedom was essential for the emancipation of the rest of Africa. His political career saw him rise to become the premier of Nigeria's eastern region, and later, Nigeria's governor general, and then first president, when the country became a republic in 1963. Even as the head of state, his leadership style was shaped by his philosophy of African unity. Zik consistently pushed for policies that would strengthen ties between African nations and reduce divisions created by colonial borders. His approach to politics stood in sharp contrast to the ethnic nationalism that characterized other leaders of the time. While others focused on advancing regional or tribal interests, Zik was committed to the idea that national identity should trump ethnic identity. In fact, as highlighted in the document of Ethiopians and Pragmatists, this belief sometimes cost him support even from his own ethnic groups, the Igbo. But Zik was undeterred. He knew that the dream of a united Nigeria, and by extension, a united and strong Africa, could only be achieved by transcending national and ethnic loyalties. I dare say here that given the educational ambition, entrepreneurial drive, and spirit of adventure of the Igbo, Zik believed they would contribute tremendously to the liberation, economic growth, and trade integration of Africa. Little wonder that today you would find in practically every African country a community of Igbo professionals, traders, and business persons thriving and creating opportunities for themselves and their host countries. At the heart of Zik's political life was his deep commitment to Pan-Africanism. His speech, The Future of Pan-Africanism, reflects his lifelong belief that Africa's destiny lies in its unity. For Zik, Pan-Africanism was not just about solidarity. It was about building institutions that could promote collective security, economic cooperation, and political integration. He envisaged a future where African states would either federate or confederate, voluntarily pooling sovereignty to achieve greater strengths and common goals. His belief in the importance of human dignity and freedom was evident in his call for African states to ratify conventions guaranteeing fundamental human rights, social security, and economic opportunity for all citizens. Zik was particularly concerned about how post-colonial states clung to the cultural and political legacies of their colonial rulers, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, etc., which often bred suspicion and rivalry, unnecessary rivalry, between African nations. In his speeches, he argued that African unity must transcend these colonial legacies if the continent was to achieve lasting peace and prosperity. This was why Zik advocated for regional cooperation frameworks, such as customs unions and common markets, long before these ideas became concretized in the Lagos Plan of Action for Africa's Integration, and now the African Union's Agenda 2063. He also emphasized the need for African countries to reject foreign interference. He believed that Africa should stand together under a doctrine of non-interference. For Zik, a united Africa could not only ensure internal peace, but also protect the continent from the insidious influence of external powers. His commitment to unity was reflected in his speeches and political life. It was evident in his personal choices. His decision to begin his professional and political career in Ghana was an early indication of his belief that African unity transcended borders. Throughout his career, he built alliances across ethnic lines, formed partnerships with other African leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, Haile Selassie, Kenneth Kaunda, to name a few, and supported efforts to create regional political unions. His advocacy for economic cooperation and social integration was not limited to Nigeria. He actively participated in discussions about broader African unity, such as those leading to the creation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. Even in retirement, Zik remained engaged in politics, running for office in 1979 and 1983. Although unsuccessful, his participation demonstrated his unwavering belief in democracy, constitutional governance, popular participation, and the building of accountable institutions across Nigeria and beyond. In the story of his life, we find valuable lessons for today's Africa, a continent still grappling with the basic problems of underdevelopment, poverty, division, food insecurity, youth unemployment, and governance systems that have proven unresponsive to citizens' needs. These account for the widespread disillusionment with liberal democracy across the continent, especially among young people who constitute more than 70% of our population and who believe that Africa has been unable to take its economic destiny into its own hands. Zik observed how colonialism left African nations economically fragmented and overly dependent on their former colonizers. He argued that without a unified economic approach, African countries will remain vulnerable to external powers and exploitative economic arrangements. Today, African nations still face this dependency. Most African economies are reliant on exporting raw materials and importing finishing goods, a dynamic that perpetuates trade imbalances. There is still minimal processing of agricultural products by way of value addition. And in the extractive industry sector, African ownership has been reducing, and again, little value addition is taking place. Consequently, Africa retains less than 10% of the value chain of most of its precious minerals. And African continental and regional organizations depend largely on foreign financing to fund their operations. According to the Africa Governance Index by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, African economies are frequently susceptible to external shocks, as seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently, the effects of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. These crises have underscored Africa's precarious position within the global economic system and the importance of Zik's vision of an internally strengthened economy that could withstand global disruptions. Unfortunately, contemporary Africa remains a major importer of stable commodities, making it susceptible to price fluctuations beyond its control. Zik also stressed that political freedom was incomplete without economic independence. In his view, a politically free yet economically dependent continent would be vulnerable to internal dissatisfaction and external manipulation. Today, Zig's words echo in the lives of millions of young Africans, the Gen Z, and we have seen the struggles that they are engaged in today. Struggles to find work and sustain themselves, often leading to disillusionment with democratic governance and an interest in alternative systems. This issue is particularly pressing, as Africa's youth population is the largest in the world. Data from Afrobarometer reveals that while democracy is widely supported in theory, young people across Africa are increasingly disenchanted with its practice. Youth unemployment remains a significant challenge. The World Bank reported that youth unemployment rates in sub-Saharan Africa were among the highest globally, with some regions facing rates above 50%. The absence of meaningful job opportunities have left young Africans feeling alienated and frustrated with political leadership, contributing to the lack of faith in democratic institutions and the sporadic unrest across the continent. Corruption compounds this sense of disillusionment. Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index consistently ranks African countries among the most corrupt in the world, and many young Africans view corruption as a major obstacle to development and to their progress. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation's index also highlights governance failures, with unaccountable leadership eroding trust in democratic institutions. This erosion of trust has real consequences. It fuels migration, the Japan that we often witness, some of our young people taking risks to walk across the Sahara, try to swim across the Mediterranean at great peril. Civil unrest and a growing preference for authoritarian figures who promise stability and growth over democratic principles and stagnation. The great Zig warned that without unity, Africa would be vulnerable to political instability and external intervention. He advocated for a collective security approach that would guard against foreign influence and stabilize the continent from within. Yet today, political instability remains one of Africa's most significant challenges, with internal conflicts and security issues exacerbated by foreign interests and intervention. The NATO intervention in Libya, which resulted in the killing of Gaddafi, triggered the collapse of the country and unleashed terrorists and violent extremists in the Sahel countries. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, which today are threatening to quit ECOWAS, have experienced multiple coups in recent years, largely due to dissatisfaction with civilian governments which have been overwhelmed by the terrorist threat and have failed to deal with the spread of terrorism and the existential security threats facing their countries. These security threats are emanating from a fractured Libyan state, unable to control the flow of terrorists, separatists, and other international criminal groups across the Sahara-Sahel zone. Zig's call for a united African defense mechanism resonates here, as these nations face both internal strife and pressures from foreign powers interested in maintaining dominance over Africa's political, economic, and security systems, especially its vast strategic minerals. These security challenges are linked to Zig's concern about economic fragmentation and disunity. When African nations remain economically fragile, they are vulnerable to both internal power struggles and external exploitation. Moreover, instability often creates an environment where extremist groups flourish, posing a direct threat to democratic governance and regional stability. According to the Global Terrorism Index, Africa has become one of the regions most affected by terrorism, with groups exploiting weak governance and lack of opportunity to recruit young people. The success of the Multinational Joint Task Force, the MNJTF, deployed by the countries of the Lake Chad Basin area to fight Boko Haram terrorists is illustrative of the strengths in a united African security architecture and a common approach. Whilst there remain isolated attacks by Boko Haram here and there, now and then, this largely Nigerian-funded military alliance of affected countries has undoubtedly degraded the infrastructure of Boko Haram and the fighting capacity of the terrorist group. A similar determined approach across the Sahel region, involving major African countries with proven military and financial capabilities, will be decisive in defeating the various terrorist groups menacing the very survival of these Sahelian states today. Across the continent, we see that social movements are rising just as Zig and his contemporaries rose to challenge colonialism and imperialism. Recent protests in many African countries have highlighted young people's restlessness and political expression. How shall we respond? If Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe were alive today, facing the challenges of poverty, unemployment, corruption, and insecurity, which are the drivers of these social movements today, he would likely have echoed the message that he spent his life championing. He would have insisted that the most effective solution for Africa's problems lie in African solutions. He would have urged Africans to harness their tremendous resources to meet the basic needs of their populations, the needs of security, shelter, clothing, education, health, employment, infrastructure, etc. That is, to tackle the urgent issues of poverty and meet the basic needs of the population, to stem this rise of social movements. Through his speeches and writings, particularly The Future of Pan-Africanism, Zig envisaged African unity as a way to establish political stability, economic self-sufficiency, increasing cross-border trade, and common security architecture across the continent. He believed that a united Africa could stand strong against internal and external challenges and become a force on the world stage if countries pool their resources together to create common markets, strategic industries, and strong continental infrastructure. This is why it is encouraging that beyond responding somewhat reactively to the challenges of our time, Pan-African movements such as Africans Rising, and I see that Anambra is rising. These are movements to mobilize and renew the commitment of all of us to the vision of Zig, to the vision of a strong Africa. For example, the Borderless Africa campaign is being championed by young Africans and other civil society organizations, Africans Rising, made up mainly of young people across the continent, pushing for the removal of visas for intra-African travel removal of tariffs to promote higher levels of trade among African countries. It is sad that decades after Zik and others, African people can still not move freely across their own continent. And in the ECOWAS sub-region, our own sub-region, intra-West Africa trade is still hovering around a paltry 12 to 15%. By way of comparison, the EU intra-European trade is between 65 and 70%. In the ASEAN region, where Asia, we often look at it and we say Asia is prospering, intra-ASEAN trade is at least 60%. They are trading among themselves. That means they are creating job opportunities for their young people, keeping them productive and out of harm's way. The AU adopted a protocol for free movement, but only 4 countries have yet ratified it. And these countries are Mali, Rwanda, Niger, Sao Tome, and Principe, while it requires 15 ratifications to come into force. Perhaps Nigeria and Ghana can take the lead as a challenge to champion this cause in honor of Dr. Azikiwe. In Zik's view, unity was not just a means to an end, but the foundation upon which Africa's future must be built. He saw African unity as the key to solving the root causes of the continent's poverty. He believed that allowing Africans to take hold of their tremendous human and natural resources, engage in beneficiation, developing appropriate technologies for transforming the lives of rural populations, providing relevant education and skills training to Africa's youth and women would propel the continent into a post-colonial world of genuine independence and prosperity. In light of the current challenges facing Africa, and particularly African youth, the time has come to really get serious about the business at hand. And in order to stem the rising social movements of disenchanted African youth, I believe we must move quickly in addressing the following. 1, political unity and cooperative governance. Zik was acutely aware of the political fragmentation that colonialism had left behind, warning that Africa's progress would be stunted without cooperative government. And we are seeing that. He believed that Africa should establish a political framework where states could work together on shared interests while respecting individual sovereignty. In modern times, this vision could be realized through an empowered African Union and African regional economic communities, that is RECs, such as ECOWAS, with authority, real authority, to forge cooperative policies across the continent. And a framework of cooperative governance, African nations would jointly address critical political issues, such as anti-corruption efforts, transparency measures, judicial independence, open governance, and democratic integrity. Zik also foresaw the need for a strong collective security system in Africa. In the future of Pan-Africanism, he warned against the dangers of external interference and internal conflicts, advocating for an African defense strategy. In today's context, where violent conflicts, insurgency, terrorism, and instability persist across the continent, Zik's vision of a common African defense force is prescient. This calls for a speedy operationalization of the African peace and security architecture, and in particular, the African Standby Force, with its regional component, for instance, the ECOWAS Standby Force. A unified African Defense Force could dramatically improve the continent's ability to address security challenges. Terrorism and insurgency have plagued regions such as the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and Central Africa. These issues are beyond the capacity of any single country to tackle alone. But with a common defense force, Africa could effectively deploy resources and personnel to conflict zones, supporting peacekeeping operations, and stabilizing countries and areas at risk. They also emphasize the importance of Africans creating its industries rather than relying on foreign imports. In his vision of Pan-Africanism, he outlined a unified approach to industrialization where African states could work together, pooling resources, expertise, and labor. He saw that Africa's development could only be sustainable if it was grounded in self-sufficiency and collective investment. In contemporary times, a united industrial program could revolutionize Africa's economy. By developing a centralized strategy for industrial growth, Africa could focus on building essential industries such as manufacturing, technology, and agriculture, transforming the continent from a supplier of raw materials into a producer of finished goods. This shift would not only create jobs, but would foster a competitive economy that could reduce Africa's reliance on imported goods and boost self-reliance. Under a unified platform, Africa could establish regional industrial hubs to maximize each country's natural resources and talents. The new Partnership for Africa's Development under the African Union Development Agency, order NEPAD, has rolled out several initiatives in line with AU's Agenda 2063 that should be implemented. Projects such as the Single African Air Transport Market, the African Integrated High-Speed Railway Network, and free movement of all persons, and African Passport are important projects in the integration of Africa and in line with ZIC's vision. Nigeria is also among countries that are involved in the 4,500-kilometer Algeria to Nigeria fiber optic project. Reliable information indicates that the Algeria to Niger border segment has been completed and is operational, but awaiting reinforcements carrying loop systems to ensure high network availability. The feasibility study focusing on the Chad, Niger, and Nigeria segments are also underway. I want to also highlight what a unified industrial program can do to Africa's collective development as envisioned by SIG, taking a cue from the efforts of one of Africa's leading institutions, the African Development Bank Group, and its partners. Over the last 8 years, the bank has invested an estimated $55 billion in infrastructure, including roads and highways, transport corridors, seaports, airports, ICT infrastructure, and regional power networks. A few examples of this massive investment include the highway connecting Enugu to Bamenda in Cameroon, a transport corridor that will serve 11 million people. The railway line connecting Kano to Maradi in Niger Republic, and the ECOWAS flagship Abidjan to Lagos highway project. The Anambra State Investment Summit, which took place just 2 days ago, to showcase projects that have progressed from conceptualization to bankability is a step in the right direction to position Anambra State as a gateway to attracting both foreign and local investment. The Anambra Industrial City, the Rail Master Plan, and the new Oka City are critical projects that would create job opportunities for the youth and produce not only for the Nigerian market, but for the sub-region and the continent as a whole. The Dangote refinery, a sprawling industrial complex, the largest single-train refinery in the world, with a capacity to produce 650,000 barrels of refined petroleum products per day, is a testament to Nigerian ingenuity and African entrepreneurship. Projects like the Dangote refinery create jobs, have multiply effect on the national and regional levels, provide cheaper and reliable fuel for transportation, agriculture, and industries. These are the types of transformational projects that would propel Africa out of poverty, and indeed, the kind of major industries that we need across the continent to create high-paying jobs for our youth. Zik warned that Africa's economic fragmentation and dependency on foreign currencies and markets would also leave it vulnerable to exploitation and economic instability. A united African currency would reduce transaction costs across borders, making intra-African trade more accessible and profitable. A single currency would give the African Central Bank, to be headquartered in Nigeria, control over monetary policy, allowing it to focus on the unique economic needs of the continent rather than accommodating external demands. By managing its currency collectively, Africa would have a stronger negotiating position in global financial markets, attracting foreign investments under terms more favorable. And an important first step in this regard is the creation of the West African ECO, which ECOWAS has been spearheading for some time now. Time has come for ECOWAS member states to demonstrate commitment to this strategic tool in West African integration by meeting the conditions for the introduction of the common currency, the ECO, without continuously postponing it. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfTA, would also be a boost to a common currency. The more we trade among ourselves, the more it becomes evident that we desire a common currency. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in Zik's United Africa, we find not only solutions to individual crises, but a comprehensive approach to building a stable, prosperous continent. His vision is a blueprint for a self-reliant Africa, where economic, security, and political integration lay the foundations for true independence. The establishment of a single African currency, a free trade zone, unified industrialization programs, a common defense force, and cooperative governments are essential steps in realizing this dream. In honoring Zik's ideals, we must embrace a pathway towards a secure, economically independent, and politically stable Africa. His legacy calls upon African leaders and citizens alike to adopt a mindset of unity, to move beyond the boundaries drawn by history, and to build a future where Africa's people are empowered, prosperous, and united. In naming the Nnamdi Azikiwe University in Accra, where we are today, the Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport, the gateway to Nigeria in Abuja, and numerous streets, stadia, and libraries across Nigeria and Africa after Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. We are entirely doing the right thing, and he's entirely deserving of it. As we assemble here to commemorate the life and times of an African icon, the African Union is in search of the next chairperson of the Commission. It is hoped that in the search, the focus will be on the Pan-African credentials of the candidate, their vision on the issues that were at the core of Zig's profound thought, the projection of African personality and dignity, good governance, harnessing the continent's resources for the benefits of its peoples, especially its youth, through free movement of persons, goods, and services in a truly borderless Africa, and a collective security for the protection and safety of Africans. The current focus of the campaigns on the linguistic divide, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, etc., are sadly a throwback to the colonial divisions of old. The searchlight should be on which candidate can take the continent on a pathway towards realizing the dreams of the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism, such as Zig, embodied today in the noble objectives of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the Africa Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. To conclude, allow me to quote from a speech Zig delivered in 1959 during the visit of Osadifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah to the Eastern Region House of Assembly. And he said, and I quote, "I look forward eagerly to the day when Nigerians, as citizens of a fully independent and sovereign state, can join our honored guests and the people of Ghana, not only in enjoying political freedom, but also in participating in the titanic struggle for the freedom of all Africa from exploitation in every form, and under God, create a hate-free, fear-free, and a greed-free continent peopled by free men and women. And I pray that Almighty God may give us the strength to accomplish this Herculean task, which it has pleased history to assign unto us." That was there at that time. "Which it has pleased history to place upon us, the current and future generations." Will somebody say amen? Amen. I thank you very much.
Let me know, what do you think about this proposal? What is your take? Let us know what you think about this implication. If you are an expert in terms of economics and foreign affairs activities, I'd like to learn from you. What do you think about this proposal? How viable will it make our economy in Africa be? What will be the gains? What will be the positive gains that will be derived from this proposal if implemented?